Hi, everyone. I'd like to introduce Sondra. She's a writer, thinker, and an artist. I also want to thank Don Salmon for this introduction. He has some of the best recommendations. And I'm really excited for this conversation, Sondra.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to talk about these topics.
Absolutely, same here. And when I looked at your background, it seemed very intriguing because it's hard to find the cross between philosophy and a lot of these subject topics that you're researching. Like it's a great melting pot. So I'm very much looking forward to hear your insights on these topics. But before we begin, I would love to know how you got interested in these questions.
Yeah, I'll give a bit of a personal background just because I like to tie abstract philosophical questions with the existential and the personal. I think that's the only way philosophy has any real and live meaning. So I would say that I've always been quite interested in religion because I was raised in a religion that really permeated every aspect of my life and my family. I won't name the specific religion, but I will say that many people who leave consider it to be on the cult spectrum. It is quite a high demand religion and it's quite patriarchal. There's a lot of control. So I would say that, you know, it works for some people at certain stages of their lives, but for me, it was very suffocating. And I would say that now with my current understanding of religion and the role of religion in modern society, I would consider it to be not the future of healthy religion. So I experienced more the darker side of religion and the more controlling side and the more irrational side, I would say. And yet I've always had this interest in spirituality and this sense of the sacred. And I feel that I've always had a connection with the divine, and I couldn't dismiss that experience just because my experience with religion was a little less than healthy. And so my interests really revolve around what is the fundamental experience of God and what does that refer to in the world? Because if God is beyond or before space and time, and yet we human creatures live in space and time, then we have to somehow find a way to carve these paths through time while referring to the timeless. And this presents certain difficulties, and religions often get this wrong, I would say. So what is the relationship between the fundamental experience of God and then these culturally and socially conditioned gods that we posit and that people seem to believe are the one true fundamental reality, the one true God? So that's a little bit about my background in terms of my philosophical and spiritual formation. I also have written a memoir that talks about some of these topics. So it's called The Sea Once Swallowed Me, memoir of love, solitude, and the limits of language. And it kind of talks about these questions that I've been trying to live throughout my life, these questions of how we develop a separate sense of self while also understanding the fundamental unity of all beings, that there's this tension between selfhood and eternity, a tension between love and solitude, a tension between language and what language describes and what is beyond language. And so these are all things that I explore in my work.
And if you had to give, like if someone is not familiar with your writings, if you had to give an introduction to what religion refers to and how modern religion is not aligned with that, how would you explain that to someone who's new to your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I believe that religion refers to the foundational structure of reality. And this relates to conceptions of God, in that if God is the utterly immanent foundational structure of being, then religion cannot refer to a set of facts in the world. It can't refer to something that is strictly historical or scientific. If you are going to garner religious meaning from the historical, then you need to somehow find the seed of universality or the seed of eternal truth in that, and then allow that to be fully incarnated in your human self. So I think this kind of links back to this distinction that I make between God as the ground of our being and gods as these socially conditioned containers or organizing principles that govern certain communities or certain religions. So maybe I should just explain that as briefly as I can in order to get a little bit closer to the meaning of religion, because religion is meant to refer to God and is meant to encourage the practice of coming to know or practice God. So I would say that just as simply as I can describe it for now, and then we can talk more in depth about that. But I would say that one thing that I've tried to reconcile is the idea in more sophisticated Christian theology. There's a pretty widely accepted idea that God is being itself rather than a being among beings. This is something that the Christian theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas said, and many people have repeated that in different ways over the years. And then in other religions, there's this idea that God is consciousness. God is the fundamental ground of our being. God is that which is so near to us that we cannot see him or her, whichever gender you use to describe what I believe is inherently genderless. But I think that this idea of God being that which is so near to us that we cannot see God means that we have to craft these gods in time and space in order to have a window onto the real, onto the ground of being, onto consciousness. And this window can either be an icon or an idol. And an icon is something that is able to become transparent so that you can see through it to the inner essence, so that you can see to the God that it refers to or the particular essence that it refers to. Whereas an idol is that which traps the gaze so that you can only see the material appearance of the thing. And so I think that all of our gods that we create of particular religions can be icons of the living God, of this pure ground of possibility and love, or they can be idols that we end up worshiping instead of seeing how they root in the ground of the real, root in the ground of possibility and love. So I would say very simply, that's sort of a broader definition of God versus the gods that we create in order to be able to even speak of the God, the ground of being, because the most fundamental God is ineffable, is before language and logic. And so in order to even speak of this God, we have to impose these linguistic constructs and these temporal constructs in order to speak of those things. So I'm going to stop there for now, and then we can talk a little bit more about the religious elements.
Do you feel like this difference between God, the fundamental nature of God, which is unity and love, versus these different representation of gods, which we have, like every religion has many different gods and all different rituals and tradition that you follow to reach that God. Do you think those two differences arise from the way we are like maybe misunderstanding religion, that maybe we are reading all these texts literally instead of seeing them as mythology?
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. So going back to the role of religion as referring to fundamental reality, I would say that anything that refers to foundational reality is going to necessarily utilize these tools of myth and metaphor. So all founding principles, all foundational principles can only be spoken of in terms of mythology and metaphor. I mean, if you even look at the Big Bang, for example, there's no logical way for something to come out of nothing. And so even the Big Bang is a scientifically sophisticated mythology in some sense. All beginnings are mythologies. And if religion refers to these foundational principles, the foundational structure of reality, then it has to utilize these mythologies. And you can even see this in quantum mechanics, that there's a great science writer, Philip Ball, who talks about this, that you can only talk about quantum mechanics using these metaphors. And where a lot of misunderstanding happens is that people take the metaphors for describing quantum reality itself, which they don't. You can't describe quantum reality using these systems of concepts and language that we employ, because it is sort of the foundational level of reality in some sense. And so I think that, very interestingly, modern Christians are really obsessed with this biblical literalism and fundamentalism. And I speak in terms of Christianity because I think it's more common. I think it's more common in the West to want to interpret everything literally, materialistically, historically, scientifically. There's a biblical scholar, John Dominic Crossan, who refers to that as fact fundamentalism. And he says that, we have this worship of facts and we don't understand frameworks, the symbolic frameworks that religion refers to. And I think I've studied historical Christianity a good amount, and I think it's pretty impossible to deny that the biblical writers, in particular the gospel writers who were writing about Jesus, were very consciously aware of the fact that they were crafting narratives that were meant to refer to a spiritual reality, but they were not at all meant to be literal. There's another great scholar named and theologian named John Shelby Spong, and he wrote a book called Biblical Literalism, a Gentile Heresy. And so he talks about, he kind of traces this literalistic impulse to the Greeks who took over Christianity, but said it would have been completely foreign to the Jews, who knew what they were doing, and they were consciously crafting these symbols and mythologies in order to convey these universal truths. And unfortunately, what we have today with Christianity is this fact fundamentalism and this literalism that renders Christianity quite obsolete and irrational at times. And I also think it makes it very rigid and dogmatic. And so there's no real possibility for inner transformation unless something is translated into symbol, myth, metaphor. That's where it becomes universal.
And this nature of trying to understand things literally, it could be happening from many different perspectives, like even as you pointed out, even with archaeology, trying to understand like how long ago these events happened and trying to match all those facts, and then trying to understand Christianity from that point of view while matching facts versus losing that essence of this could be symbolism or a metaphor. And it's interesting like how there are different ways to approach that, and then it kind of like solidifies that misunderstanding.
Yeah, it does. Every time I hear someone say, oh, we found this archaeological proof that the Bible's true, or, there's scientific evidence that this thing is true, I think that's very misguided. I do think that historical truth, and I think particularly historical truth, is typically used in order to legitimize the authority of a particular religion. So you find this a lot in Christian religions, that people will say, we can trace our historical roots back to this council or this prophet or apostle. And because of that, we are the one true church. And so I think that if you're questioning the authority of your particular sect of Christianity or your particular religion, because every religion has some form of these power dynamics and claiming who has the proper authority for the most part. I think if you are in that situation, then you might find history useful in revealing to you, if the origins were generally led by people who are acting in good faith, like if you have a founder of a religion who is a sociopath or a psychopath, then you might not trust the current system that you live under. But I do think that those are temporal concerns, and those are real concerns that people have who live in a temporal world. But I do think that the fundamental nature of reality of religion, which refers to reality, is that which can be redeemed from this narrow lens of the historical and be brought into the living present. And that is not something that just history can do. You can take a historical story and you can find the kernel of the symbolic and the universal in it. But just knowing, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 or whatever, however that goes, just knowing that fact is not going to do anything for you on a psychological existential level, though it may be interesting information and may be useful if you're a historian. It's not necessarily a religious claim.
It's an interesting, if I may use the word, conflict between science and religion, where science can view religion as a perspective, not as a truth, and same vice versa from religious perspective, science can be seen as just a perspective and not the ultimate truth.
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day, and I think the way that I like to see religion, and I would be curious what your perspective is on this as well, but I think when I look at different disciplines like science, history, psychology, philosophy, these are all parts of one body, let's say. They're all parts of like one body of reality. And they're all different tools. They all sort of have a scalpel of understanding, and they can analyze and dissect this body and say, well, this is what the heart looks like. This is what the brain looks like. This is what this looks like. But I think religion is the body itself. And what's interesting about the body is the body can't see itself. It's not very self-reflective. And so it makes it really difficult. Religion is in a distinctly difficult position, because as soon as it talks about itself, as soon as it talks about the God that it, at least in principle, should be referring to, it becomes an object to be dissected, just like these other sciences or academic disciplines. It becomes an object to be dissected, and it ceases to be the everything, right? Like consciousness, if God is pure consciousness, you can't see consciousness. It's that which sees. And so in order to see what God is, you have to kind of craft this idol. You have to say, this is what God looks like. He looks like an old man, or he looks like, a goddess, or he looks like this, he looks like this, and he acts like this. I think the only thing that you can derive from the pure existence of God, as we sort of talked about before, is simply this fundamental unity, and possibility, I would say, can be derived from that as well. And you can call that unity love, just the sense that we are all connected. But yeah, I think it's difficult because these other subjects refer to something that is abstracted from the whole, it's dissected. But religion, as soon as you analyze it, it ceases to refer to God, which cannot be analyzed necessarily. It simply is. And so I do think religion, in some sense, has more of this broad-ranging power, and that, if I'm a Christian, I can look at a scientific thing and say, how does this symbolically reflect Christ, if I want to see it that way? But there's a very clear delineation, and that I can't then take that as some literal thing of like, oh, this scientific thing proves Christ, or it's all about Jesus. There's something arbitrary about our symbols, even as they can be transformative. And so I think probably the religious person who is truly living a religious life is able to see the symbolic in everything they encounter. They're able to see everything they encounter is able to be transformed through their psyche and become something meaningful or significant, not in a dogmatic way, but simply in a way of, I can learn this from this historical fact, I can learn this from this scientific fact. Whereas, science and psychology and history, they have stricter delineations. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly, maybe this is a bias, but I tend to want to see religion as, when rightly construed, not when seen in a dogmatic, literal way, but when rightly construed, perhaps it's that which encompasses everything. So it is actually much more broad ranging than any other discipline. But too often it's taken for being its own academic discipline, its own system of analysis, which it's not.
Yeah, I'm on same page with that. I feel like there are so many valuable metaphors in religions which can be way more advanced than what science has to offer. And unfortunately, in our modern world, we tend to throw the baby with the bathwater, kind of we have this way of looking at religion as something very bad and restricting.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think that when you understand the fundamental nature of reality, it should actually inform you to be a more rational human being. If you can understand the spaceless, you should be able to understand space better. If you understand the timeless, you should be able to understand time better. I don't think that's always what happens, but I do think there's a sense in which people who are religiously informed can, in fact, there's something prophetic about poetry. There's something prophetic about symbolism. And I've read the Quran a couple times, and the Quran is a beautifully poetic book. And there really are things in the Quran that are scientifically way too advanced to make sense in Muhammad's time period. And I do think that comes from the idea that when you are under this universal inspiration, you can have these glimpses of scientific truth as well. You can have glimpses of these other types of truths. But yeah, so I think it's also interesting because when you delineate these categories really strictly, like when you say, oh, science is one thing, history is another thing, psychology is another thing, religion's another thing, or maybe it's the everything in some sense, or the ground of everything, if it properly incarnates God, which is the ground of everything. But even as you delineate these categories, I think any delineation also betrays the fact that there's this constant communication happening between all of them, and there's no strict delineation. So science accepts these mythologies of space, time, and causality. Those are mythologies as well. I worked on critiquing science, not science itself, but critiquing certain scientific frameworks. I worked on some of that as an undergraduate with some professors. And that's something that we really delved into, is that scientists don't know philosophy. Philosophy is really underrated in today's day and age. And so they don't understand that they're making a whole host of philosophical assumptions in order to even begin to approach their work. And those assumptions go unquestioned. And so I think those are also a mythology, just like religion has its mythologies. So these are, things that are communicating and interpenetrating in some sense.
And do you think also how religion has this challenging job of it is dealing with the foundational paradigm, addressing the foundational paradigm, whereas science, its approach is more about focusing on facts. Mm-hmm. Do you think that approach in itself may be limiting for science?
I think it can be. I think what I find most limiting is when scientists cling to their beliefs without question. I'm not going to go into great depth on this because I think there are other people who can talk about it more intelligently. But one of the reigning scientific paradigm right now is the paradigm of philosophical materialism. The idea that only matter matters, and that matter is the structure of everything, is the foundational ontological principle that everything is matter. And mind, the mind that is perceiving the matter is somehow secondary and perhaps is, born of matter in some complicated way that no scientist can explain. And this paradigm doesn't fit the facts very well. There are many facts that fall outside of that paradigm that can't be fit inside that scientific paradigm. But what can be a little frustrating is when you speak to people who are working on these things scientifically, they're truly unaware of the waters, the conceptual waters that they're swimming in. They're invisible to them. And so there's this assumption that, well, of course, matter is primary. Of course, consciousness ends with the death of the brain because the brain is that which generates consciousness. And they never stop to think, well, actually, that's not very philosophically sound, because they don't know what philosophy is. They don't know that philosophy is also dealing with these fundamental principles that they themselves are blind to. So I would say what's most restrictive is just that they, there's this, I can't remember who said it, but I think this is true, that there's no one who's not doing philosophy. There's just people who are doing it badly, doing it unconsciously. So scientists are always operating with these philosophical frameworks, but most of that is unconscious. And there's definitely links between philosophy and religion, because I think we also operate religiously often. The religious impulse is universal. It's not going to go away, but there are ways in which it manifests in more irrational ways. And there are many atheists who are quite religious in their beliefs and quite dogmatic in their beliefs, and who worship, certain principles, who worship maybe materialism or fact fundamentalism, but there's not an acknowledged sense that we are worshiping and that this is a religious impulse,
Interestingly, it can happen, that also has a religious version of it. Like some of these religious leaders can also be working within a limited framework, or floating in this religious concept. So both these different worlds have their own version
yes,
of like a framework.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that has been very, very important to me, because as I said, I came from a religion that was quite narrow. And actually, this is just a little quote from the book that I'm working on now. And it talks about this distinction between God and gods. And so I said, a God is not the real, as in God, like real with a capital R, but a socially conditioned container for the real, a vessel for our hopes, insecurities, ideals. A God will fill any container you offer. A large vessel will contain a larger God. A small vessel will only speak small words. And then the small Godded will feel compelled to proclaim, I can do nothing about it. My God speaks and I obey. And so I think that only these socially, culturally conditioned gods are actually capable of speaking. I think that fundamental reality is mute, and that we give voice to it. We are the ones who speak for God, and that's always conditioned by the human and by our human frailties. And so I think it's actually true what, some of the criticisms from new atheists, a lot of times those criticisms are really sort of vicious and poisonous, but I think that a lot of the criticisms are true, that if we think that these socially conditioned gods are the one and only true God, then you can say, well, if you don't believe in Zeus or Artemis or Athena, then I just believe in one less God than you, because these are all just arbitrary gods, And so I do think that religious leaders who say, my God compels me to ban these particular things or to not accept these particular people, I think that's pretty narrow. Like, our only real hermeneutic for understanding what God says is love. And then from there, I think with love and possibility, with this freedom and love and this tension between the two, you can work within your particular culture, but that the gods of these particular ethical mandates are constantly changing, constantly being birthed, constantly dying. And some of these gods we should let die. We should let them birth new gods, new ways of seeing the world. And of course, the fundamental reality beneath remains unchanged. God is the ground of our being, remains unchanged, but that we can continue to innovate and use our imaginations to some degree in conversation with tradition, not thinking that we in the modern world have all of the answers, but that these gods can continuously evolve. And if they don't, I don't think that's God. I think God, as the eternal and the timeless, when God incarnates in history, it looks like a flow. It looks like something that is continuously evolving, even though paradoxically it is the eternal. You know, what does love look like in this age? Does it look different than it did in the past? So I think that if we don't allow God to flow, then it becomes a stagnant pond that is a breeding ground for all kinds of diseases. And that's what some religions have become, is this stagnant wanting to contain the ineffable God into these small containers that can be controlled and bullied by humans, you know.
And just so we understand this a bit more deeply, can you, and I'm asking this question because you have done a lot of research on this. Can you comment on some of the universal truths of Christianity?
Yeah. So I think that I was about ready to abandon Christianity myself, actually, because even though I always felt the experience of God, there were a lot of things in Christianity that didn't make sense to me and that I didn't really like. But I've found myself continuously drawn back to Christianity. And I think because it's sort of my religious language, the religious language that I was raised in. And so, of course, I don't believe that Christianity is the only vehicle for attaining God or anything like that. But I do think there are certain really beautiful religious truths that are contained in Christianity. One of the things that I love about Jesus is the symbol of the cross. And I think it has many meanings. Christ has been interpreted and reinterpreted by every kind of person throughout history. But one thing I love about the cross is that God, if we consider Jesus to be an incarnation of God or the incarnation of God, is, you know, with his arms outstretched, naked before the gaze of the crowd, completely vulnerable. And there's so many meanings in that. I think of the mythology of Adam and Eve, which was clearly a mythology. Adam means man or human in Hebrew, so it was clearly meant as a mythology. But the mythology of Adam and Eve, and how when they partook of the fruit and they gained self-consciousness or knowledge, they immediately wanted to cover themselves. There's a shame to consciousness or to separate selfhood. There's this shame that we sometimes feel for just being human and knowing that we're human. And so they immediately wanted to cover themselves and then run from God. When God calls to them, they're like, oh no, we did something bad. And so they want to run from God. And I think the clothing that they're wearing, how they clothe their nakedness, I think that can refer to a lot of things. There's an English playwright who wrote, his name is Harold Pinter, and he wrote something like, we can think of language as a constant stratagem to cover our nakedness. And I think it's the same with beliefs and ideologies, even more so, that it's this stratagem to cover our inherent nakedness as these fragile ego selves. And when I see Jesus on the cross, to me, it's a sense of perfect openness and fragility and shamelessness, this overcoming of shame by being exposed to our shame. The symbol of the cross was also considered to be the most shameful symbol in Palestine in those times. It was reserved for the lowest of criminals. And for Paul to write in the Bible, to write in his letters that we glory in Christ, we glory in the cross, was such a crazy thing to say, to glory in something that was so shameful, to take pride in it. But I think Jesus, with everything that he does and all of the symbolism throughout the Gospels, there's always this paradoxical heart of turning over the tables and saying, it's not the powerful who are closest to God, but it's those who know how weak they are and how vulnerable they are without God, or how vulnerable they are as separate selves. So it's one thing I love about Jesus and the cross. And I'm going to try not to go too deeply into this because there's a lot that I think is really interesting, but I think also the idea of crucifixion, I think we're all kind of crucified between time and eternity. So there's the horizontal plane of time, and then there's the vertical plane of eternity. And I do equate time with selfhood to some degree, because I think that physicists and philosophers agree that space-time is an illusion in terms of fundamental reality. And what are we as separate selves except scraps of space-time? You know, I am me and not you, because I inhabit a different particular point in space and time, including the inheritance of my parents' genes and my environment that I was raised in. All of these are temporally and spatially constructed things that make me me. And so in some sense, that is an illusion. In another sense, it's an illusion that we have to live into. I think it's a necessary illusion. And I think that's the paradox that we live as creatures that are both human and both divine, that we live this separate selfhood, even as we are aware that the separate self is sort of an illusion and that we are one with God already. So it's another thing I really like about Jesus, in this sense of suffering your selfhood, letting yourself be both separate from God and one with God, as in this paradoxical dance of the Trinity, that God is separate from Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and yet they're all one and they're all kind of dancing, and yet their essences are not totally dissolved. So it's another thing I really love. And then just one more thing that I was thinking about recently, the idea of Christ's vicarious suffering, the idea that Christ took on himself the wrath and fury of a God that needed blood, basically. The idea of blood atonement can be really problematic, and a lot of Christian theologians don't like that interpretation, I think for good reason. But I see it very differently. And I think, once again, these have many meanings. So I'm not saying this is the ultimate meaning of this story, but I think that what I've learned from the idea that Christ took on himself the sins of everyone is that that's what all of us have to do. This idea of radical responsibility, that when I see another school shooter shoot up an elementary school, or all these other horrific things happening, I can't just identify with Jesus unless I also identify with Pilate and Judas and Hitler and all of these other horrible people, but also with Mother Teresa and all of these other saints. And so I think that the idea of suffering for the sins of everyone is this idea that no one is innocent. That's an illusion. That's an illusion of the separate self. That if you see an act of evil and you're condemning it while remaining on your podium of righteousness and saying, oh, I'm so glad I'm not racist, or I'm so glad I'm not killing babies, or I'm so glad, this is what we see in the political sphere today, is this constant battle of self-righteousness. And the moment we say that, the moment we are truly delusional. And what Christ shows as the only one who at least Christians deem innocent and perfect is the one who did not believe the lie of innocence, who believed that he was in fact responsible for everything. And because he believed that, he was free from the burden of separate selfhood. Because the moment you take responsibility for everything, both the joy and the goodness and the pain and the suffering, you cease to identify with your own narrow personal responsibility. So there's a sense in which I try to remember this all the time, that we all take upon us the sins of the world, as well as the joys of the world and the successes of the world.
That's a really beautiful interpretation I've heard of cross. I've never heard that before. I think that's such a beautiful way to describe it. And we see that metaphor even in other religions, where it's about removing those layers of story that we hide ourselves with. And in some cultures, it's referred to as ego, and that's what ego death is about. Letting go of, and in different words, seeing your own nakedness without all those stories that we hide behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also a sense in which showing that nakedness to the world, like being set on a hill in a public place, your shame being exposed to everyone, is a terrifying and empowering idea. I wrote something about how, I think there's this, let's see, I think it, it says, so this idea of carrying your separation and carrying the shame of that, you know, people feel so much shame about who they are and whether they're good enough and whether they're worthy enough. And so I wrote something about this with Christ. I'm just going to read a couple lines. I carry my unfleshed thoughts. I carry my untranslatable flesh. I suffer the wide spaciousness of my unheld soul, the razor thin narrow of my gate to salvation. I stumble up the hill of a time-stretched self, nearly crushed beneath the cross that halves me. Crucified am I between time and eternity, pinned against the vertical halving and the horizontal stretching. He said something about how Christ is crucified to the unreal, and then he's resurrected into a oneness that also preserves the essence of the separate self. So I think there's this dual tension happening where I see Christ as a principle of divine differentiation, that you know, we are all one consciousness, but consciousness wants to know itself in countless iterations. And so carrying this separate essence is a way in which we can deepen and sharpen the blade of our particularity, that we can become more and more this particular essence and kind of deliver that essence back to the whole, and not to over-identify with it. I think what's fascinating about that idea is that paradoxically, again, we can be more authentic and more brave in our lives and more brave in accepting our authenticity when we realize that there is a gap between who we are on a fundamental level and the person that we are called to play, the role we are called to play in this life. And so I think that both are true, and that we live that paradox in our lives, that we are both not this particular scrap of space-time, and yet that we have perhaps a moral imperative, a duty to explore all the possibilities of this particular self.
Do you, in our email exchanges, you mentioned about a path of descent to enlightenment? Would you, versus a path of ascent? Is what we are talking about Jesus' symbolism of enlightenment? Would you refer to that as path of descent, where we see more of our humanness versus reaching to the God?
Yeah, I think yes. I think Jesus does embody that path of descent. In the Greek, the term is kenosis, or self-emptying. So Christ self-empties in order to then become one with God. So I think both of these things are occurring. After Jesus dies, it says that he descends into the underworld to save souls there. And of course, part of the Christian story is that he takes on the sins and the sufferings, as we talked about before. So I think his is definitely a path of descent, but then there's also an ascent. And so I think that both paths are legitimate, but I think both paths need to have a seed of the other. You know, with any opposites, you have to have the yin and the yang, and then like a little bit of both in the middle. There has to be some balance on both sides. And so with the path of descent, I think I find that I'm more drawn to that path because in my childhood and religious background, there was very much a denial of all things human, of anything negative, of anything dark or different or scary. You couldn't speak of anything like that. And I think for me, it's been very healing and liberating to descend mindfully into these different layers of darkness and find the seeds of liberation in each of these pains. I think what's important, though, is that we don't also become attached to the path of descent in a way that, you know, many literary writers really kind of revel in their suffering. I think that's sort of a mark of, you know, sophisticated artist or something. And I think that for me, there's a descent into suffering in order to redeem it. And you have to be willing to give it up and not attach your identity to your suffering or to your victimhood, which is equally damaging.
And can you comment on path of ascent? How does that look like in real life?
I think the path of ascent is more focusing on concrete things you can do in order to overcome certain dark elements. And I think as you do that, often the darkness sort of falls away on its own, or it heals itself on its own. So it's more a focus on the light and then allowing the darkness to kind of fall away. I think if you focus on the path of ascent, and once again, there's not like a seed of descent in it, or like an integration of the darkness, if there's not at least a little bit of the path of descent, then you will find a lot of, spiritual gaslighting and a lack of integration. And when you're not able to integrate the darkness, you have to project it onto other people, or you have to deny parts of yourself. And so you see this a lot in certain religions where the other is really demonized because these people are wicked and these people are not special and called and chosen like we are. And so that darkness has to go somewhere. And I think it's better to allow that darkness to be healed by your love. And so I think both of these paths have to contain a little bit of the other, but some people I think are just drawn to one path over the other. And I think some people who have a large amount of trauma and may be afraid of their trauma need to at least try the path of descent, because what you learn from that is that there's nothing to fear. I write about death kind of a lot in my work, and I think for me it was a practice of learning to live with my mortality in such a way as to befriend it and also imbue my life with a sense of urgency. But I think what's so fascinating about these things is you may focus on something you're afraid of and kind of interrogate it with gentleness and curiosity. And as you do so, if you go deeply enough, you'll find that seed of liberation. I wrote about this, and I think it's actually similar to ideas in Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta. I just started learning about Vedanta recently, and I started reading this book, The Seer and the Seen, and it seems like it's pretty similar to some of the things that I've written as well. But I wrote something about death, that one side of a duality purified reveals the other side. So the day humanity discovered death is the day we stumbled into the white hot flames of eternity. Now you will surely die, said God, after the first humans ate a seemingly innocent fruit. And so we became dual creatures. Those that can see their own deaths are both the seer and the deathed. And so the one who stands apart and who can observe the fact that they are dying or are going to die is the one who escapes death as a final event. And so I think that all of these things show us paths of liberation if we don't fear them and we descend mindfully into them. There is a certain death that occurs, some sort of ego death, and we should come to terms with that and we should take it seriously. But also that anything real about you is going to persist.
That's very interesting. Just recently, I was having a conversation with someone where we were talking about similar things, like you can find liberation in darkness as much as you can find it in the light.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah,
and
I'm glad that people are talking about the same ideas,
Yeah, it's interesting, like how that is also a kind of a sign of like interconnectedness.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, like how sometimes where sometimes I'm having a personal conversation with a friend, but a few days later I come across a video or a book which is talking about similar thing.
Yeah, I find that fascinating, and I don't know how to make sense of it, but I do think there's something about that I don't know. I think that when you are in tune with your highest self, perhaps you attract the things that you need spiritually and the things that you're thinking about. I've had similar experiences, especially lately, where I'm like, how did that happen? Like, this is exactly what I've been thinking about or exactly what I've been needing. And then it just kind of pops up in my life,
It's like self-talking to itself.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that's really cool.
That brings to my next question. Since you understand this, you have studied these topics so deeply, I would love to get your insights on how do you see Eastern religion, how Eastern religion sees divine divination as versus Western religion? Like what are some of the things that we can learn from each other?
That's a great question. And I will just start by saying I'm not an expert on Eastern philosophies or Eastern religion. The more I think critically about Western religion, the more I find that I'm stumbling into Eastern territory. So I think that like there's something really profound about Eastern thought that is in some senses and in some iterations much more philosophically sophisticated, to be quite honest. And once again, the Western religions are more part of my blood, more part of my understanding. So I still feel more comfortable with those symbols. But I've certainly found that as I critically examine my Christian beliefs, I will write things that are extremely Eastern, and then I will read something in the Tao Te Ching, or I'll read something, in this book that I started reading and some other Eastern books, and I'll be like, oh, I'm a Buddhist or a Taoist or a Hindu or something. So I think that there are some commonalities there. I think there are a few things that we could comment on, and feel free to correct any of my misunderstandings of Eastern philosophy as you understand it. But I think one thing that is really problematic about the Western understanding of God is that, again, even though more sophisticated Christian theologians often refer to God as being pure being itself, typically they don't refer to as consciousness, though I think there's an analogy there. I think our terms are never exact. I think there's typically an analogy that God is simply the most fundamental thing we can experience. So even though that's how some philosophers and theologians think about it, I think in the popular imagination, and maybe this is true in all religions to some degree, but God is conceptualized as a deity who is much like a human, but with just really cool superpowers. And I think this is the God that is really easy to criticize from an atheist perspective, because this is a God who is basically like a human, except nicer and cooler and more powerful. And there's a lot of issues with this conception of God. And I think one of them is the problem of evil. So this is a really common argument that if God is all good and all powerful, why doesn't he intervene in human affairs? Why doesn't he stop at least some of the suffering? Why didn't he just at least take away the Holocaust, stop that from happening? And I think it's a really profound question. And people who believe in this theistic deity who is pulling strings and is able to intervene in these affairs will often invoke the divine wisdom of God and our puny understanding as being the reason why we can't understand why God doesn't heal a child who is sick with cancer, but then he heals another child who's sick with cancer. And I think you can say that. I mean, of course, if there's a deity who's super powerful, that deity is going to know a lot more than we do about how the ends justify the means, I suppose. But I think it's still really problematic. There's a Jewish mystic named Etty Hillesum, and when she was in Auschwitz, she wrote letters and I believe journal entries, and some of them were preserved. And she wrote a lot about her experience of God, and she wanted to really clarify and testify and witness to the fact that God was always with her, even in Auschwitz, that God had not abandoned her. And yet, I think that coming from this perspective of someone who was in the Holocaust experiencing this horrible event and trying to come to terms perhaps with what God is and why God doesn't intervene. She said some things that were really powerful. And one of those things that she said is that, God, you are helpless without me. That you can't save me, but I can save you. I can give you a place in my heart. I can feed you and care for you in the sanctum of my soul, in my own inner temple. So we can become vessels for God. We can birth God into the world. And that's something that is appealing to me, because I do think that the problem of a God who can intervene and doesn't is a really real problem for a rational and loving conception of God. I do think that there's some intervention perhaps in different ways, and I'm not going to get too deep into that because I think that's a little bit more complex. But I think that I also see the idea of Mary as the God bearer. I see that as being a universal human archetype as well, that we are meant to bear God in our own wombs and birth God into the world anew in each age. And so there's a sense in which we are all incarnations of God, just like Jesus was an incarnation of God. And there are as many instantiations of deity as there are human beings, authentic human beings. So I think that's one way in which Christianity needs to distance itself from a strictly theistic perspective on God as being this person who exists in the world. Just one more minor thing about that, because I feel like there's a few people who are talking about consciousness who are pointing this out recently, which is really good. But the word exist or existence comes from the Latin to stand out from something. And so if someone were to ask me, does God exist? Even as a believing, faithful Christian, I would say no. God does not exist in the sense that he stands apart from reality, but rather that God is, as the Quran says, he's closer than your jugular vein. God simply is. And then individual gods that are conditioned by cultures, that are conditioned by our narrow human concepts, of course, those can be said to exist or not exist insofar as we possibilize their reality into our specific communities. I think they exist when we consent for their existence to flower forth in our communities. But I think if you say, does God exist? I would say no, but God is, and you can incarnate God. You can let God have space in your soul to act in the world.
That's beautifully described. But yeah, I too get stuck on that question a lot, like why God doesn't intervene. Where do you see all this going? Like what do you see is the future of religion? Do you see like in modern world, it seems like it's losing its hold more and more. So what does religion look like in, let's say, 100 years down the line?
Yeah. Yeah, that's of course a question that I can't answer with certainty, but I think that my vision for a healthier religion would, first of all, take the criticisms of religion pretty seriously. So, Nietzsche famously declared a long time ago, God is dead. And what he was saying was not that God should be dead or that he wants to kill off God, but rather that God was already dead. God already had lost the power and potency to transform human societies. But, later he wrote, and he kind of clarified, only the ethical gods have died. And that's how I define sort of these small gods, is that they're ethical gods. They're gods that we posit in some future place, and then we try to reach towards them. We try to reach towards these ideals. And there are many different kinds of gods. I think that many ideologies function as gods. They function as these organizing principles that posit a particular ideal. Democracy, capitalism, communism, socialism, Nazism, all of these ideologies have functioned basically as gods that rally people around them. And I've said before, more people have died in the name of democracy and capitalism, and also communism and socialism, than have died in the name of Jesus or Allah. We invade Iraq and Afghanistan in hopes of transplanting democracy because it's the one true political system. So the religious impulse is just as strong today, I would say, as it's ever been. It's just channeled towards different ideologies rather than towards the highest ideal of our becoming, right? So I would say that everyone worships something, but some people worship more consciously than others. And if you're worshiping a particular ideology, then you will be bound to it. And also if you interpret your religion ideologically, then you will be bound to it and your possibilities will be narrowed. So I think that we need to take these things seriously, the problems in modern religion seriously, but I think we also need to realize that the religious impulse is fundamental to being human. We're not going to escape it. We have to find more rational ways, more whole-souled ways of practicing religion and spirituality that don't idolatrize the religious system, that don't think that the church itself or the religion itself is that which will save you or will save the world, but rather that all of these systems are pointing to a divine reality that is in everyone and is in everything. So I think religions have to take these things seriously. I think they also have to be more rooted to the local and to the particular cultures that practice them. So I think that religions like Christianity need to remember that Jesus's parables were spoken in a very, very particular context that was very rooted to the land. You know, the olive trees, the mustard seeds, all of the parables were super related to Jewish ideas and very particular Jewish concerns, and that those are all great, but that we have to find ways of taking the essence of these religious principles and letting them incarnate anew. I use this word a lot, but of letting them be fully embodied in our space and time in order to transform us in the here and now. And so we shouldn't be afraid of heresy. We shouldn't be afraid of breaking things. Whatever's real about our religion will be preserved as we preserve it in a spirit of love and openness. So I think there needs to be a lot of changes. I also think that religion has to incorporate a deeper love and respect for nature and the idea that all livings are sacred and all livings are divine in some sense, that a flower and a stone and a landscape is also an icon of God. And that to destroy these things is to destroy the body of God, is to destroy all that is sacred. And so I think religion needs to recover this sense of the universality of the sacred, that every scrap of space-time is sacred. And when we make every scrap of space-time sacred, then the spaceless and the timeless and the fundamental reality of God can begin to flood everything in space and time. And that's what enlightenment is, or salvation.
Do you think that some of these mythologies will still stay around, or would there be a different way to express religion in future?
That's a good question. I think we'll have, new mythologies are always arising in some form, but I do think that any good mythology is pretty resistant to different external changes. I think that's why people have found profundity in some of the oldest religious texts to this day, and they don't get old. I read the Tao Te Ching every morning. I think I would consider myself as much a Taoist as a Christian at this point, though I still don't consider myself an expert on it because I haven't studied it in enough depth. But I feel like the way of the Tao and that acceptance of the nameless flow in all things is something that is really natural to my way of seeing the world. And this is one of the oldest texts, and yet there's nothing in it that is outdated, And so I think that really profound systems of religious philosophy and really profound mythologies will always contain a kernel of truth. But again, I think we have to not be attached to our beliefs. And that's so difficult. I think religions can be especially dangerous in this way when they attach worthiness or salvation to the correctness of your beliefs, because then your very goodness and worth is tied to something that is fundamentally unreal. A belief is a tool we use to uncover a certain set of possibilities, and they can be very helpful tools, but they're not reality itself. They refer to something again. And so I think that often religious people are very defensive about their beliefs because they feel that if I'm wrong about this, I'm going to hell, or I'm bad. And so I have to be right and you have to be wrong. And I think that the more lightly we hold our religious beliefs, the more we can live the reality of our religions and what our religions refer to, which is one fundamental reality. Different colors, different essences are embodied in different religions. So there are differences, and I think essential differences, because diversity is good. I think that's what mind wants, is to know itself in these different ways. But that, the core is the same.
And do you, like, this is just a thought experiment. You know how in the past there was a point where science took over religion, like science became more dominant. This is, and as a thought experiment, I'm just curious if do you foresee this happening in future, where if we hit a point where science is not able to answer some of these questions, a new reformed way of looking at religion, religious ideas would take over science? Could that flip?
That's a great thought experiment. I love that idea. It's very creative because, yeah, I think that opens up different possibilities, and I can see what you're saying there. I do think that in some sense, what science illuminates is just how incredibly small our understanding is and how much we need this expansive awareness. I'm reminded of this every day. I think I used to feel threatened by that. Like I would think about what will technology look like in a couple hundred years, and it would kind of freak me out. Like, you know, my kids are going to be cyborgs or something. And what if they have these computer chips that download all this information? And I don't necessarily think that would be a good thing, but even if that happens, it just illustrates again, like how much more can the human species evolve, and how we're really just cavemen and cavewomen scrawling on our walls, on our cave walls, you know, in these really primitive ways. And I think if anything, that really powerfully reminds me that I need to root in the one fundamental reality. I need to practice non-duality. I need to practice contemplative prayer. I need to practice meditation, because I might not have all of the facts to fit into this framework, but also these facts are not going to persist. Once I am rid of this body, the ideas of spatially and temporally constructed facts will no longer be very important. And so I do think that it shows us again, like the entire corpus of human knowledge, as beautiful as it is, as much as I love that, I'm a huge fan of learning about everything, is so puny. And so focus on your spiritual practice as well, you know, make that a priority, because that will at least expand your consciousness enough to realize how puny human understanding is, and to grasp in a pre-knowing state, in a pre-linguistic, pre-logical state, the real fundamental nature of reality.
Yeah, it does have that timeless quality, which is independent of facts.
Yeah.
So it will remain relevant regardless of what timeline it is accessed at.
Yeah, which is, I think, I don't want to say comforting, because sometimes there's a false comfort about that. But I do think that it's a reminder that spiritual masters of all ages are more advanced in many ways than the most brilliant people in our age, you know, more advanced in the ways that matter. And that should be our focus, because as much as we can accumulate knowledge, and of course, my career is in the accumulation of knowledge to some degree. I hope to be a professor. I'm starting my PhD program this fall. But yeah, that there is a sense of, do not forget to prioritize the one thing that really matters, because your knowledge is not going to buy that or get you closer to that fundamental reality.
Yeah, I think it was Osho who also pointed out to something similar, where he talked about how some of the most advanced scientists and philosophers are still kind of playing with toys limited in time and space, compared to like some of these advanced spiritual beings.
I love that. I also think, going with the theme of the path of descent, I think that often the more we are committed to one of these paths, the more we realize their limitations. If we are open to that, you know, sometimes we're too attached to those paths. But I know as a writer, I'm pretty obsessed with language. And one of the things that I really explored in my memoir is, the more you descend into language, the more you realize how insufficient language is. And with any great and breaking pain or love or any of these huge human emotions, language can't even touch that. And so then you think, well, what else does language not touch? and you get to these experiences of God, and you get to these experiences of death and eternity and all of these things that language can hint at, but it can't really touch. And I think that's the same with anything. If you descend mindfully into the material world, you see its limitations, that, you know, philosophy can circumscribe this area, science can circumscribe this area, but it does so at the expense of everything else.
This has been a really, really insightful conversation, Sondra, and and it was really refreshing to look at some of these, because I've been having these conversations on non-duality for a while, but this was really refreshing to see from many different point of views, both from philosophical perspective as well as a religious perspective. So yeah, thank you for so many insights. Is there anything I missed? If you want to share anything today other than what we talked about?
I don't think so. You asked wonderful questions. It was really so fun to talk with you and to get your perspective as well. That's yeah, fascinating stuff. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, this has been a very fun conversation. You've been able to communicate some of these big concepts in a way that's easy to understand. And I'm very much looking forward to how your work blossoms. It definitely sounds very intriguing and fascinating.
Thank you so much, Suma.
And your website is sondrawriter.com, correct?
Yes, very simple. Just SONDRA, writer, as in I write things.com. Yeah, that's my website. And I do have monthly essays that I send out to subscribers that are philosophical and spiritual, but I don't think I try not to make them too dense. I try to always have them be linked to my own life and to real human experiences. I'm also working on more of a philosophical spiritual book now, so you can get updates on that from my monthly mailing list, and you can check out my book, my memoir, on Amazon or anywhere else that you buy books.
Thank you, Sondra. I wish you all the best with everything.
Thank you so much, Suma. You too.
Okay.